Remnant from the Ashes feels like the perfect remedy for the gamers that have tried and tried to get on board with the Dark Souls franchise but were sent into fits of rage due to its brutally unforgiving melee combat.
Talk about what we're gonna okay, or you can hit that. Yeah. I don't know. Alright.
I think deep down those gamers knew there was no beastly sword or magical dagger they could find that would provide that level of enjoyment that they're craving, but maybe, just maybe, swords and daggers aren't the solution that they need.
I need guns.
Okay, which ones?
I need all the guns!
Alright.
And so steps forward Remnant from the Ashes. Remnant from the Ashes has often been labelled as Dark Souls with guns, but for me that's an insult to the gunplay mechanics of this game. I'd say it's more guns with Dark Souls, because the gunplay takes centre stage in Remnant, and the times that I saw the similarities to Dark Souls were mostly confined within the menus of the game. There's red crystals that act as bonfires which restocks your ammo, respawns all the enemies and refills your dragon shards, which are basically Estus flasks. Then there's other similarities such as levelling up your character as well as your weapons and your armor, but that's about it. There's the obvious differences like a bucket load of guns, but there's more subtle ones like there being no death penalty, so you can keep all your XP when dying, and what's growing to be more and more popular design choice in gaming is the world is procedurally generated. You'll start the game creating a character and picking an archetype from long, medium and short ranged starting loadouts, but as you progress you can easily switch up your style however you see fit. As you play you'll find the occasional story driven item being dropped from bosses, or maybe an NPC that's hidden away on a level somewhere, but the best gear is usually hidden in the world, and that brings me onto the procedurally generated world. Remnant is a nightmare for those walkthrough authors and those that use them, because when trying to Google the location of a certain item, they've had to list all the possible locations to where you might find that item. Your playthrough will not only have a completely different layout to the map, but you could find different items, different hidden locations, and even different quests. I absolutely love this aspect. It adds so much replay value to the game. Developers Gunfire Games have catered to those who want to find as much gear as possible in a single playthrough though, with the adventure mode option allowing you to revisit a certain world that'll be randomly regenerated every time you reset it, meaning those loot hungry players might have to roll the dice more than once to find a certain piece of precious loot. Now, the combat mechanics are unbelievably satisfying. It's a degree of satisfaction I normally only get from first-person shooters, but even being a third-person game, the gunplay mechanics just feel so perfectly refined. There's no additional but mediocre gameplay mechanics here that bloat it up so the game can claim to have multiple gameplay features. The devs knew what they wanted to create from the get-go, and they didn't deviate from that vision and refined the gunplay mechanics to near perfection, crossing every T and dotting every I, and while that might be a risk from a marketing point of view, I think anyone who picks this up and enjoys third-person shooters will absolutely fall in love with Remnant from the Ashes. There's a good amount of weapons to choose from that even include melee weapons, so it's not just guns, but really the melee weapons are more of a last resort to buy yourself some breathing space if you're getting swarmed on. There's no hip firing, so all of your aiming will be down the sights, and when you typically hip fire, you'll be swinging your melee weapon instead. It all works seamlessly, and another layer to these mechanics are the mods that can be applied to your weapons. These can provide alternative firing modes or damaging and healing areas of effect, but they're limited in their use. These mods require building up by simply firing the weapon at an enemy before you can make use of the mod to take big dirty chunks out of the enemy's health. Remnant has 3-player co-op too, so the procedural generation of each map will constantly keep you on your toes when entering your friend's world. Everything will seem so foreign to you, you won't recognise any of the layout while the host is strutting his stuff with the utmost confidence.
I don't remember any of this. Yeah, Alex, you sure this is the place? Yeah, pretty sure.
I personally prefer to play solo, but having tried Remnant's co-op on the PS4 a while back, I remember it being much simpler than Dark Souls. It's just a nice and simple drop in and drop out from the menu, so there's no finding a summoning crystal, placing down a summoning sign on the floor, spinning around in your chair 3 times and shouting dilly ding dilly dong, I need a friend. Just to play online with your mates, it's not that excessive. You'll be tethered to the host, so you'll be travelling the dimensions together. All items picked up are shared between everyone. There's a maximum of 3 players. The enemy's health grows depending on the number of players that are playing, and the enemies are scaled to the host. So even if you're a low level host, the enemies won't scale more than 3 levels above your own. This could make it a breeze for higher level players, but stops the game being impossible for low level players. So you're still better off all being around the same level to each other to balance the experience. I do think the more casual players can play Remnant and still find a healthy challenge, even on more difficult settings, of which there's 4 to choose from, and you can even turn on or off one-hit kills and the aim snapping to tweak the difficulty even further. This might offend the FromSoft purists, but honestly, who gives a shit? The enemies' attack animations are far more predictable than FromSoft enemies. There's audio cues for the tougher enemies, letting you know a badass is on his way, and the spatial audio designed for all the enemies is done well, so you're constantly being fed these audible clues about an enemy's location. Again, this will sound too forgiving to some, but much more accessible to others. You've still got to defeat that enemy though, and that is purely skill based, and therefore if you do manage to put an enemy down, you'll still feel like the otherworldly monster slaying badass that the devs were clearly hoping that you'd feel like. The more intelligent enemies have decent AI that works really well, hiding in spots, flanking and approaching when I'm reloading, and then some just charge at you regardless, and having that mixture of enemies all vying for your life makes for some pretty intense interactions. But I do think the boss designs were a little lazy in all honesty. Don't get me wrong, thanks to the incredible gunplay mechanics they were still fun, but there's only a few bosses that posed a genuine threat by themselves. Some of the best FromSoft bosses are remembered for their alternating attack patterns and phases to the fight, but the majority of the bosses in Remnant aren't that difficult on their own. The difficulty comes in the waves of standard enemies that are thrown at you throughout the boss fight. This is more annoying than a fresh new challenge, fending them off and looking for that window to do damage against the boss itself. Occasionally there's bosses that fight on their own, and I would have loved to have seen more creativity like this in more of the other bosses. Like I've mentioned, the exploration will vary from player to player, but the satisfaction of the search is pretty simplistic and linear regardless of the map's layout. Items have a colour-coded glow to them, so they aren't too difficult to find, but even so you'll still want to check every nook and cranny, down alleys, through underground entrances maybe, or even some pretty well hidden secret areas. You'll find weapons and armour sets as well as rings and amulets that offer some interesting buffs to your character. There's quite a few to find too, and some are way more beneficial than others, so it's a rewarding search overall. You'll be constantly on the lookout for chests or smashing crates, hunting for the various consumables to help you in battle, scrap, which is the game's main currency to spend at merchants, or the numerous types of materials that can be used to upgrade your weapons, with the highest levels of each weapon requiring the rarest of materials. Your character's development comes in the way of traits, and you'll unlock these traits through simple progression, but you'll also unlock some skill-based traits such as increased vaulting speed after you've vaulted over enough obstacles, or increased weak spot damage after you've hit the enemy's weak spot enough times. Now the visuals are a bit of a mixed bag. There's almost a cell shading effect being used, and in areas it can look really blotchy with low res textures, but other areas look much crisper and pleasing on the eye. All the different worlds that you can explore all have stark differences in colour too, which makes for a nice refreshment on the visuals as the story progresses. Those low res textures are likely helping the game's optimization, keeping it running smoothly, but even so it's a surprisingly demanding game. There's a free next-gen upgrade to those on console, and for 60 FPS you're limited to 1080p and a 4K 30 FPS option. There's no official word of a sequel just yet, but it certainly sounds likely considering the rumours suggest 2 trademarks have been filed for Remnant From The Ashes 2 and just simply Remnant 2. I really hope this happens because I think the revenue generated from the first Remnant could easily be well spent towards a sequel, and the production value and storytelling is one area I'd love to see Gunfire Games touch up a little. There was a clear intention to tell a good story, but the delivery of this story was limited to some very mediocre character models and lots of notes to find, but the lore itself was really interesting and worth reading. There's always room for improvement in any game, but for me, mechanically, Remnant from the Ashes is an incredibly enjoyable and fluid experience, and surely that leaves Gunfire Games with the room to work on the lore aspects and the world design. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on a potential sequel, but what do you guys think of a second Remnant game? Was there anything you'd like to see being done differently maybe in a sequel, or is it a case of just being more of the same, please? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.